to our fourth session out of 6. Before we go any further, I want to introduce a terrific lady, Joan Green, who's agreed to share her knowledge and experience in the field of criminal law with us today. Counselor. And we're delighted to have her. As I think I've indicated to you, Joan worked with F. Lee Bailey for a number of years, as well as with Joe Bolero, a very well-known criminal lawyer in Boston. Worked in the correctional system, I think, among other places. Those of you who come from Boston or the area may know, remember, the infamous in those days, Charles Street Jail. So Joni has some great stories, some great experience, and I know that you will enjoy her commentary as we move forward. So the question for the day, of course, is, who killed Merrill? Many of you, I think, remember this story. It was the O.J. Simpson case of the 50s. There were no white Broncos, but there were very strange events. As we know, there were 2 trials, 10 or 11 years apart, with 2 very different verdicts. Supreme Court case, which became quite important, and which we're going to talk about. Murder trials, for perhaps obvious reasons, take the headlines. We have a case that's occurring now. I don't know that it's a murder case, but it might be. Ross? Yes?
No.
He's waving at me.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
just waving to
Oh,
someone.
all right. A directional wave.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's your name?
So, murder trials are, we have this case, maybe a case in New Mexico, where Alec Baldwin had a gun handed to him. The guy said it was a cold gun, and lo and behold, it was not a cold gun, and we have a dead cinematographer. I have no idea what's going to happen in that situation, but it's a perfect example of the everyday events that somehow take over the headlines. And if we go back over history, whether it's Leopold and Loeb, or Lizzie Borden, or Timothy McVeigh, or the marathon bomber, I mean, there are dozens of these cases. And I chose this one. Give me 1 second. I chose this one because principally of the impact of the prejudice at the trial, before the trial, and what that issue still means today as we speak. I happened to see, just a couple of nights ago, my wife and I watched the movie Good Night and Good Luck, the story of a piece of Edward R. Murrow's career and his broadcasting at CBS around the McCarthy hearing. And it brought back this whole story of the big lie and disinformation. This was back in 1954. As it happens, the Shepard trial was going on at the same time. One thing had nothing to do with the other, but here we are in 2021, and that McCarthy scenario, I would suggest to you, is replaying itself as we sit here in this room. And Morrow's ability basically to keep the network executives off his back to tell the story the way he wanted to tell it, to me was quite interesting. Morrow smoked 60 to 70 cigarettes a day, and he died of lung cancer at the age of 57. Actually, it was Edward R. Morrow. He was born Egbert Oscar Morrow, and Roscoe Morrow, and he changed his name when he was in college to Edward. I don't know if there are any Egberts here, but it's not a name perhaps that would have been particularly useful in broadcasting at that time. So, you had a point.
Yeah, murder trials don't normally go to the Supreme Court. It's kind of unusual, isn't it?
Well, it was because of the constitutional issues that were raised. We had a case last week where we were talking about a lynching and a case that went to the Supreme Court because of other constitutional issues. So you're right, they don't see many, except where you see murder trials going to the Supreme Court are most often executions, people who have been sentenced to die, and the court has been called on to, basically to quash those executions. As you know, go ahead, John.
A murder case could get there two ways. One, if a murder occurs on, say, in federal jurisdiction, say on an army base maybe, or in a national park, maybe like the Gabby Polito case maybe, it would go through the federal system. But it can also get there, and a lot of them go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court takes very few of them because it's the last-ditch effort by a defendant to appeal to get him the habeas corpus, which is what happened in the Sam Shepard case. You go into the federal system on constitutional issues and work your way up to the Supreme Court. They take very, very few of these cases, but people try all the time.
So, coming back to this really basic question, what we have here is the constant pull between the First Amendment and the right to freedom of speech, and specifically in this case, freedom of the press, and the Sixth Amendment, which is the right to a fair trial. And that constant pull as to how these two amendments interact and react to one another. I have a quote which I think is worth reading. It's very short. The hand that rules the press, the radio, and the screen, and the magazine rules the country. That quote is from 1942, 80 years ago. It was never more correct than it is today, and that was a long time before the internet, television, social media, and all the other stuff that we have today. That was actually a quote from Judge Learned Hand, who was one of the great judges of the 20th century, who did not get to the Supreme Court, but who was a judge for many years in the Southern District of New York, and also on the Second Circuit, where he sat for, I think, 30 years. A very well-known judge. His full name was Billings Learned Hand. He went to Harvard and Harvard Law School. He was appointed by President Taft to the Southern District, and actually by President Coolidge to the Second Circuit. So we have this, as I say, we have this constant pull between the two amendments. What I wanted to do was very quickly to go through the early part of the timeline on this trial, and then to make a few comments, and then turn it over to Joni for some of her early thoughts. So let's just remind ourselves quickly of some of these more important pieces of the timeline. The night of July 3rd, 1954, when Marilyn is murdered on the second floor of the house, and Sam went to sleep on the first floor with the other couple there. They go home. Marilyn goes upstairs, and that's the last time that Sam, supposedly, sees her, and then he's awakened, he goes upstairs, and there's this incredible story that he tells. And I think it is kind of an incredible story. The jury, I guess, thought, the first jury, thought it was an incredible story. He runs up the stairs, he sees his wife spread out on the bed, the blood is everywhere. He gets attacked and knocked down, maybe briefly unconscious. Then he gets up and he runs downstairs and sees something outside. He runs outside. Remember, the house is on the lake. Runs outside toward the water, gets knocked down and unconscious again, comes back into the house after he gets up, and then calls the guy next door, or 2 houses away, Mr. Houck. It's very interesting about Mr. Houck, because Mr. Houck and his wife have been living there for a number of years, and there's a side story here that maybe Sam and Mrs. Houck, maybe Mayor Houck and Marilyn have been having something going on. And so Sam calls Houck. Houck calls a variety of people, including the police, and finally things start to kind of move along. We know that day that the coroner gets there early, and the coroner plays a major role in the early part of this case. And the police don't really get there until later. Sam finally hires a lawyer, an experienced quote-unquote criminal lawyer who's also a friend of his, Bill Kerrigan. On the 7th of July, Marilyn is buried. Sam issues a statement. He says he's cooperating with authorities, and he offers $10,000 for an award. So I also forgot to mention a very important thing, because Sam says that there was a bushy-haired man who was the guy who knocked him down. Well, you know, this becomes the basis for the famous television series, The Fugitive, where the bushy hair changed to the one-armed man. And they changed a number, of course, other things as well. Later, it turns out that one of the possible suspects is a guy who wore a toupee. So, you know, we've all seen a lot of toupees. I haven't seen too many that I would describe as bushy hair. But, you know, maybe I'm moving in the wrong circles. So, on the 10th, Sam gives a formal statement to the Cuyahoga County Sheriff. He denies having an affair with this woman, Susan Hayes, who was a former nurse. He returns to work in the clinic in which the family, his father, 2 brothers, and he worked. And then, not then, the press is really all over this case. I think one of the statistics I saw was that one paper, the Cleveland Press, published 399 different stories in 180 days. And that was just one paper, although it was probably the worst, the one that was the most aggressive in this respect. They had front page editorials, they had cartoons, they were really going all out. And then the coroner holds an inquest, a public inquest, at the gymnasium in this little town. And there are hundreds of people who come to this inquest. It's over a period of 3 nights. a couple of hours each night. Sam is there and required to answer questions from the coroner, and his attorney, although present in the audience, is not allowed to intervene or to say anything. In fact, on this, I believe it was the second night, the coroner tells the attorney to scram and get out. This is a very unusual procedure. But it isn't until the 23rd of July, which is, over 2 weeks later, that the police actually take over the investigation. And then Susan Hayes, who's moved out of the area, admits that she had this affair with Sam. And the grand jury meets, and there's a $50,000 bail. They return a first-degree verdict, and Sam goes to, he's arrested. And then this massive press coverage goes on for 3 months. During the jury selection, there's local and national news coverage of this. Think about this for a moment. The names of the prospective jurors, photographs of these people, their phone numbers, addresses, are published in the paper. Not once, but many times. They become really local celebrities. And the judge, who is running for election in the November of this trial is in October. He's running for re-election. And the prosecutor is running for election. Then the jury is finally sworn in. There's no sequestration of this jury at this time. And then on November 3rd, they go to visit the Shepherd home. And Sam is brought into the house in handcuffs, while the jury is wandering around the house and being directed, shown where the body was, and et cetera, et cetera. Then there are a couple of fake national news reports, or reports that are made that turn out not to be true. The first one is a release by Walter Winchell, who of course is out of New York, who claims that there is a woman who bore Sam Shepherd's child illegitimately. That press release, disappeared after that. None of that was ever raised at the trial. Presumably that came from a false piece of information. Dorothy Kilgallen, another well-known national columnist, who appears next week in the Lenny Bruce trials that we'll talk about, apparently had an interview with the judge before the first trial. Nice to meet you, nice to meet you. And he says, why did you come here? And she says, well, I wanted to see what the story was. And he said, quote unquote, he's guilty as hell. This is the judge before the first trial. For reasons that are not clear to me, Dorothy Kilgallen doesn't deliver that bit of information until years later. So, I don't get it. Anyway, there's a police press release that calls Sam a barefaced liar. On December 17th to the 21st, the jury deliberates, and they're finally sequestered during the deliberations. But they're able to make personal phone calls, which are basically unmonitored. So who knows to whom they were talking? Who knows what kinds of information they were getting? I think I saw that subsequently they learned there were 30 ballots that the jury took, unable to reach a verdict. and then suddenly they came together again, who knows kind of where or why. And the verdict is a murder in the second degree. The judge denies the motion for a new trial, which is actually in January. Both the judge and the prosecutor are elected. And then there are a series of unfortunate events. Sam's mother commits suicide, his father dies of cancer, and then the brothers hire this criminologist and forensic expert, Dr. Paul Kirk. And he does this very elaborate examination with blood spatter techniques and basically says there's no way, two things. One, that there's no way that Sam, I forget now who was right-handed and who was left-handed, but he couldn't possibly have done it because these blows came from this side and he's coming from the other side. And then he said the blood spatter definitely showed that, and then the way Marilyn's body was placed, her legs were over the back of the bed, her nightgown was pulled up, of course the blood was awful, her face and head were very badly battered. It turns out, again, some years later, that they found two different samples of semen in Maryland. The prosecution never presented that evidence. Now, why the defense didn't, and maybe Joni might have some thoughts on this, why the defense didn't even at least raise the possibility of this, I'm not sure. But at a much later time, and we'll come back to this, it suggests when they exhumed Shepard's body many, 30 some odd years later, they found through DNA that the semen samples were not his, and that the blood spatter was not his. He could not have been in the room. So, again, they move for a new trial. They go through this. The judge keeps kicking him back, and the Supreme Court turns down his appeal in 1956. Now, I haven't seen the briefs. I don't know, what evidence was brought forth in the writ, but the court turned it down. Then, of course, there's this sidebar with this gal from Germany, Ariana Teben-Johannes, this blonde bombshell who starts writing him letters, contributes $250,000 to his defense, shows up from Germany, and it's discovered that her stepsister was married to Joseph Goebbels. So, and anyway, and then they start writing back and forth to one another. And then there's a second side story, which is that the police are investigating a robbery. They target this guy, Richard Eberling, and they find a couple of pieces of jewelry in his house that belonged to Marilyn. It turns out that Eberling is not a good guy. But within a week, they give him a truth test, a lie detector test, which I gather he passed. They do an investigation, but within a week, they clear him. Sam is then transferred to an institution, another institution, and then in 1961, his lawyer, Corrigan, dies, and a young man sitting in Boston is reading the newspaper a newly minted lawyer whose name is F. Lee Bailey, and he makes a phone call to Sam's brother Stephen, arranges to fly out to Cleveland, and the Shepherds hire F. Lee Bailey. In the meantime, in August of 1961, a guy named Paul Holmes, who was a newspaper reporter in Cleveland, writes a book that becomes a national bestseller on the murder. And then in 1962, a woman who nobody ever heard about, whose name is Myrtle Fry, who turns out to be the sister of Richard Eberling's employer, is beaten to death. And that murder was unsolved. Then in 1963, Marilyn's father commits suicide. And in April, Bailey files a habeas corpus petition arguing pretrial publicity denied Sam's right to due process. This is 7 years after the court turned down the original appeal. In February, the coroner, who was so aggressive about chasing Sam, writes a letter to the Ohio Attorney General, Bill Saxton, requesting that Governor Rhodes pardon Sam. I don't know where that came from. I haven't been able to find out. But that certainly didn't go anywhere. Then there's a decision in '64 by the U.S. District Court, Justice Wyman, who says basically this trial was a mockery of justice that violated the defendant's 14th Amendment rights to due process, and he orders the state to release Shepard within 60 days. So Shepard gets out, he marries the lovely Ariana, and then in '65, after an appeal by the state, the U.S. Court of Appeals, in I think the Fifth Circuit, reverses the district court decision 2-1. And Bailey then appeals to the Supreme Court on certiorari for the hearing. And then in June of that next year, SCOTUS rules 8-1, and it orders the murder victim verdict invalid. And the prosecutor in Cleveland says, we're going to try this guy all over again. So the second trial begins in '66. There's a new judge, because the old guy has died. And the new judge takes very specific steps that clearly the old judge had not, in terms of limiting press in the courtroom. Sam never takes the stand. At the end of the trial, which is about 3 weeks, much less in length, the jury deliberates for less than a day and comes back not guilty. The next year, he regains his medical license. Unfortunately, in 2 separate operations, he makes a mistake. In one case, I think the lady died. In another case, there were very serious problems. So he leaves medical practice, and he and Ariane now get divorced. And in 1969, you can't make this stuff up. He becomes a professional wrestler under the name Killer. So, and then 6 months later, he marries the 20-year-old daughter of his wrestling manager. And a few months later, he dies at the age of 46 of liver failure, because he had become a very heavy drinker. So, I think there are a lot of unbelievable things that happened afterwards, but I think that's enough. Through 1970, Sam is gone. So let's turn it over now to Joan and get some of her thoughts on some of the questions, the practical issues, and the legal matters that are raised. Joan?
Well, when the Supreme Court decided the Shepard v. Maxwell case, they laid out a whole bunch of steps that courts could take to limit the effect of this pretrial publicity and they called it a carnival atmosphere that had been created in the courtroom. The easiest one of all was to take care of the courtroom. I mean, in the Shepard original trial, the press was in front of the bar enclosure, right up next to where the defense table was, where Sam's lawyer was sitting with Sam. They were all over the place. They were outside the anteroom of the judge. So when he had a conference with counsel, that could be heard. They were mingling with the witnesses. They were all over the place. It was just a zoo, a literal zoo. So now, that's one thing that the courts have done, that the press is kept in a section. Sometimes there's a representative of the press that's appointed to be in the courtroom, and other parts of the press. Now with video, they put them in a separate room. So that limitation has been reached. So, but then it gets more complicated. The problem of witnesses in the press. You know, if you're sitting in the courtroom and outside the courtroom, the witnesses are outside the courtroom, the press can be there. So there's all kinds of steps now that the court can take to insulate the witnesses from this kind of pressure from the press, or being interviewed by the press, or just bothered by the press. The most extreme of which is people go into the witness protection program from the federal government, because sometimes witnesses' lives are in danger and they need to be completely protected. You know, the judge can tell the witnesses not to talk to anybody, just not communicate with the press. And we've gotten letters we had an instance of fraud in our office involving my husband's company, and we got a letter from the U.S. attorney because we were witnesses in a case, and we were told not to talk to anybody about the case. That we were by the U.S. attorney's office. So they've done some things there, but the judge really needs to take control of the release of statements by law enforcement and people working for the prosecution. This is, you know, in the scholarly articles, most of the leaks that come out to the press regarding a criminal case come from the prosecution side. They come from law enforcement, they come from the governor, the coroner's office. That's where they come from. And sometimes these statements are needed. Like in the recent case of Gabby Polito, they were looking for her boyfriend, Brian Landry, and they were issuing statements and pictures of him and descriptions of him because they wanted to find him. So you can't limit it all together, because sometimes it serves a useful law enforcement purpose. But as I said, most leaks come from the government. The most kind of outrageous leak of all happened in the Derek Chauvin case, the recent case of the police officer accused of, or now convicted of, murdering George Floyd. Just a couple of days before the trial started, the city announced that they were paying $27 million settlement to the Floyd family. Well, I think the judge went slightly ballistic at that announcement. I mean, why the city had to announce that 2 days before the start of the trial is, you know, obvious an attempt to prejudice the outcome of the case. Then there's other kinds of statements that people get in the press. I don't know if you remember the McMartin daycare case, but there was a similar case in Massachusetts involving, called the Fells Acre case, involved accusations of the owners and operators of daycare centers, and this happened all across the country, daycare centers and preschools, where the owners and proprietors were accused of sexually abusing very young children. And there were lots of experts, psychiatric and social work experts, that came on and on all kinds of TV shows and in media and said, children never lie. They always tell the truth. Well, that particular bit of wisdom has now been disproved. In one study, people took children and kept describing to them a hospital visit they had had, what happened, where they went in, what they did, what happened to them. And within, a period of time, these children believed that they had actually been to the hospital when in fact they hadn't. So that they can be impressionable and things can happen to them. And then the investigations on those cases were tainted because parents were hauled in and told, go home and interrogate your children. And then there were very suggestive interrogations with the children by the police. So at the end, nobody knows whether those kids were telling the truth or not. And what happened in all those cases is there was never any supporting evidence, physical evidence, ever found to support the allegations. There were allegations in the Massachusetts case of dead animals being buried in the backyard. They dug up the whole backyard and there were no dead animals. There was supposedly a secret room in the house. There was no secret room in the house. So this kind of pretrial publicity can influence a jury, and it's not even coming from law enforcement, it's just coming from other sources. And all the talk shows would have this kind of information on, and they'd get a social worker or a psychiatrist to come on and testify to this. So it was impossible for those people to get a fair trial, in my opinion, because of that kind of publicity. And I'm not sure, what remedy there is for that. And the other new thing that's going on now is they have speaking indictments. It used to be an indictment, first-degree murder was like a one-liner, did so-and-so did kill so-and-so with malice aforethought on such and such a date. That was it. Now there's a whole narrative. The whole narrative of the case is put in an indictment. So when the press gets the indictment, they have a whole statement of what the prosecution says happened. And this is, I think, also highly prejudicial to the defendant. So when the defense counsel comes into the case, and they want to get there like on day one, but that usually doesn't happen, is to try and swing the tide of this publicity, that's this onslaught of information that's going on. I mean, can you imagine the lawyer's job who represents the guy that handed Alec Baldwin the gun and supposedly said cold gun? I mean, this guy, we all think he did something wrong, and the media has reinforced that. They keep talking about that. Now, it could be that Alec Baldwin has very good press contacts, that he's trying to defer law enforcement from looking at him. It could be that he never said that there was a cold gun. I mean, we just don't know all the facts, but we're getting a version of events that's being put out, presumably maybe by Alec Baldwin and the press right now.
Excuse me, Joni. So to that point, I think one of the things we now hear almost every day is breaking news.
Yeah.
And those guys and gals are out there, boy, they're beating the bushes. And I mean, that's their job, beating the bushes. But that breaking news, like anything else, needs to be evaluated. Where did this come from? I think, and we all know some reporters, are better than others. I mean, going back, we mentioned Edward R. Murrow. We all remember, I think, Walter Cronkite. And that's the way it is. Boy, that's long gone in this country. Walter has been gone a long time, and that style of news has been gone a long time. I remember, and Huntley and Brinkley. Good night, David. Good night, Chet. I mean, So it's not a question of comparing, I think, those particular people necessarily to the people we watch or listen to today, but the world has changed. And in those days, the networks, which were the major source of news, NBC, CBS, ABC, basically supported the news channels through everything else that they did. And they didn't make money on news. They made money on everything else. Today, boy, they're selling ads on news channels like crazy. And the name of the game is profits. And if you make a mistake, or you say something that maybe, whatever, well, we'll pass that by, and, we'll cross that bridge kind of when we come to it. So I think there's this, and of course, that doesn't even, as I said earlier, get to the issue of social media, which again is making a barrel of money on ads that, I'm not on social media, so I don't see this, but I'm advised that there's plenty of advertising going on, and that's part of this whole process. So.
Well, getting back to the Alec Baldwin, New Mexico situation, listening to Morning Joe yesterday morning, they spent about 15 minutes, Mika and Joe, lamenting the fact that we don't have all the facts, that the police aren't going to have a news conference till Wednesday, I guess tomorrow. I mean, this happened less than a week ago, this event. And there's a rush on the part of the media to get this in the news, find out everything that happened supposedly, which doesn't allow law enforcement to do a proper investigation. Typically in an investigation, you'd want to talk to every witness separately before they've had a chance to talk to everybody else and get everybody's story nailed down. But the pressure on the media to solve the crime, to know all the facts and to have this done is enormous. And there's also, of course, when you have maybe a murder on the loose, there's a lot of public pressure to solve the crime very quickly. So sometimes that impedes a proper investigation being done. In the Shepard case, the press was in the house. Well, what were they doing in the house? I mean, they're disturbing evidence. They're talking to people. It was not a properly done investigation. So defense counsel come in usually later, and they have to kind of try and level the playing field. So, and the aim of defense counsel is kind of different than the press. The law enforcement wants to solve crimes. District attorneys are elected, sometimes judges are elected, and they all want to look like, I'm tough on crime and I'm getting things done. And when a murderer is on the loose, it looks like they're not getting things done, and people are unsafe and unsure, and there's a lot of public pressure on them for that reason. But defense counsel, their kind of aim in what publicity they generate is to speak to potential jurors. They need to get the potential jury to understand that there are two sides of the story, to put out facts favorable to the defendant, and really their aim is you got to turn one juror. You got to have one juror stand up and vote not guilty and hold that opinion throughout the deliberation. And that's kind of where their aim is. How do I get to the jury, and how do I get to this maybe one person that can turn this trial around for us? So that's kind of, the law enforcement is coming out from one angle, and the defense counsel is coming in from another angle.
So, Joni, to that point, and I think that's a very interesting point. One of the key strategies for defense counsel, I think, often, is to try and get a change of venue. That's not always possible. What I mean is that the judge will often say, No, I mean, there's no change of venue. And many times I think the judge says that because they want the case. They want the publicity. They want all the stuff that goes along with being a part of this. So
Right.
how do those two things, I don't know, kind of not work out, but how do they come together in some way?
Well, the burden of proof is on the government to prove the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But that flips over when you ask for a change of venue. It becomes the defendant's burden of proof to prove that he's not going to get a fair trial in that location. So if you have a defendant that's got money, you can do polls. They go out and they poll people and see what the opinion of the general public, where the jury pool is going to be drawn, is. But it's very hard to get a change of venue. Judges, especially with a high-profile case, don't want to give it up. They don't want it because they're never going to see a case like that again in their judicial career. I mean, would Judge Ito want to have given up the OJ case and the judge in the Chauvin case? That's the biggest case he's ever going to see in his life. So he doesn't want to lose that case. And in change of venue, it's also expensive because they have to move the whole court. They'll get a different judge, but you have to move the whole operation out to another location. So the prosecutors have to be put up in hotels, witnesses there's transportation costs, the support staff. It's a very expensive operation. Courts are usually on limited budgets, so that's kind of the last thing they want to do is to move a case to another location. There's also problems getting witnesses because now the witnesses presumably are not close by. They have to transport them. It's a logistical headache. So that it's very hard to get a change of venue. In the Chauvin case, the defendant did ask for a change of venue. It was denied because the judge said the pretrial publicity in this case will continue no matter how long we continue it. As far as a change of venue, I do not think it would give the defendant any kind of fair trial beyond what we are doing here today. I don't think there's any place in the state of Minnesota that has not been subjected to extreme amounts of publicity on this case. So he refused to move the case, even though there were protesters outside the courtroom. When the jurors came in the morning, they were going to see these protests. So even despite all that, he didn't change it, and I think they probably that's probably one of their big appellate issues in that case.
What do you think is the possibility for an appeal here, given that and given the other issue you mentioned earlier? Do you think that Chauvin has a good case for
Well, I think he's got a
trial?
He's got a good case. I think, in another kind of aside, a lot of the witnesses gave testimony. Witnesses are, unless you're an expert of some kind, you're a fact witness, and you're supposed to just testify to facts. In the Chauvin trial, people were testifying about their feelings, how they felt, and how what they had witnessed impacted their lives. That really is not proper subject, in my opinion, for a witness. So I think he's got some good issues. But what happens in criminal trials is, having worked in criminal law for a number of years, you lose most cases. You're fighting an upstream battle, and a lot of times you're losing because you should lose because the guy did what he was accused of doing. But the courts, they'll say, oh, you have this great issue on appeal, and we agree with you that this wasn't done right and that wasn't done right. But in light of the overwhelming guilt of the evidence of overwhelming guilt of the defendant, we find the error was harmless. So you wind up losing anyway. You have great issues, but they don't go anywhere because appellate courts decide that there was enough evidence of guilt, and we're just not going to overturn that case. The other thing that they can do is change, well, we're talking about change of venue. In the OJ case, interestingly enough, the prosecution chose to file a case in downtown Los Angeles instead of out in Santa Monica. The crime took place near Santa Monica. It could have been properly tried there, but they had gotten the prosecution in LA, or the DA's office in LA, had gotten such bad publicity coming out of the Rodney King thing, the Rodney King situation, where they took the case out of Los Angeles and tried it in a place called Simi Valley. And the officers that beat Rodney King were found not guilty. They got such blowback on that they decided that they would put the trial in downtown Los Angeles, where there was a more minority-oriented jury pool, and that probably is maybe a factor that caused them to lose the case. They also, Judge Ito his wife worked for the LAPD, and he should have probably been recused himself from that case. And the defense always held over his head that they could make a motion to recuse him, and he bent over backwards to let evidence in, the evidence of the glove, all the evidence about Furman planting the glove, the stunt with the cap. All kinds of things came in there that probably did not belong in there, just because the judge wanted to hold on to this case for his own.
Actually, Joni's comments about Ito remind me of another point about the Shepherd trial. The judge's son in that trial was, Blythen's son, was a member of the homicide unit that was investigating the case. And so I don't know whether there was any pressure brought on the judge, as Joni just described, but it's interesting that in both of those cases, there was that kind of a possible conflict. Yes, Pete?
Just a quick aside, is there a noticeable difference between judges that are elected and those that are appointed for life or for a long period of time?
I think there is a big difference. In Massachusetts, the judges are appointed for life. A lot of places they're elected. I can't even imagine what that would be like, having a judge run for office. It just, I think there is a big difference.
The reason for the question is that an elected judge would benefit from doing favors for whoever gets in the most headlines. And I think
Well, they have the law and order mentality. They have the prejudice for the judge would be to show that they are really a law enforcement advocate, and they're tough on crime. They're not going to let people get away with anything. That they've got a great record of convicting people. I think that's where the pressure would come in.
thank you.
Any further questions? Well, let's take a short break. I have 5 till. Let's take a break till 5 after. We'll come back. Well, let's return. I don't want to get too far off the point, but it occurred to me that there was another case, a lot of other cases, I guess, but a particular case that I thought may have, with regard to the issue, some relevance. So, the assassin's assassin. Where were you on November 24th, 1963? Is there anybody here that doesn't remember? I mean, I think everybody remembers. Unless, of course, you were too young to remember.
Maynard, it's the 22nd.
It's 22nd.
Oh,
So there's one
well, I was in the same place.
You're talking about the assassin of the assassin.
No, that's right. The assassin of the assassin. You're right. Thank you, Joe.
You all-
Thank you, Jim. Gene. So, that's a good point. The 22nd and the 24th. So, on the 22nd, I was in Dallas. And I was actually at the airport, leaving Dallas, on my way to Las Vegas. I wasn't married. I was on my way actually to Los Angeles, but I was going to spend the weekend in I had spent 3 or 4 days in Dallas. I was going to Vegas, and then I was going to LA. So this is not why I'm telling this story, but this is in fact what happened. And when I got to Vegas, one of the memories I have, which to me is now absolutely mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing then, but I was a few years younger, was that they never shut down the casino. And so, you know, I was by myself. I was sitting at a 21 table for a fair portion of the time. They rolled television sets into the casino if you wanted to watch whatever the proceedings. But anyway, that was quite an amazing experience. But the point of this is not, certainly is not that. Jacob Leon Rubenstein. Jack Ruben. The man in the fedora hat. And I don't know how many of you remember the course of events, but we certainly remember what happened on the 24th with Ruby in the basement of the Dallas Police Department. And he, you know, was down there because he's down there all the time, and had been for years. He was kind of a, you know, a police hanger-on, a fixer, a guy who knew all the policemen. And he always carried a gun. And doesn't everybody in Texas carry a gun? Anyway,
Now.
and, you know, he basically walked up to Ruby, pulled a gun, and shot him in the stomach, and, you know, a couple of hours later, Oswald was gone. And I don't know how many of you now remember Ruby's trial, but that was very interesting. Now, how many people watch this on television? Talk about a change of venue. You know, where are you going to put this? So, he hired Melvin Belli, the king of tours. I don't know whether you remember Belli. He was an unbelievable character. And he had a building in San Francisco in which he had his law firm. And on the roof of the building, he had a cannon. And every time he won a case, they fired off the cannon. So he was really a terrific character. What? A fair question. So, a prosecutor in that case was a guy named Henry Wade, who was a district attorney. He wasn't particularly famous for that case, but he was the Wade in Roe v. Wade many years later. So that's just kind of a matter of... The judge was an unbelievable character named Brown, Joe Brown, who actually smoked cigars during the trial, had a spittoon, and he could definitely spit at least 8 to 10 feet into that spittoon, which he did during the course of the trial. And so the defense put up Belli concocted this defense, and he said that Ruby had psychomotor epilepsy. And he brought in 7 or 8 doctors to talk about what this basically meant was that occasionally Ruby would go into a spell where he didn't know what he was doing and where he was going. And so in the end, of course, this didn't work very well. Ruby, as you know, was convicted. There was also a move for a change of venue in that case. I mean, Dallas was no place to hold this trial, but that change of venue was denied. And the case took 10 days. And the judge kept the jurors there in some cases until after midnight because it was very hot and he wanted to get it over with. They took 2 hours and 19 minutes to convict him. Belli appealed and the family fired Belli because they didn't think that he had done much of a job. After the trial, Earl Warren and Gerald Ford went to Dallas and met with Jack Ruby. And they had a private conversation. And later, not much later, Ruby said to them, I was so distraught that they had killed my president. And I was trying to prevent Jackie from having to testify at a trial about the killing of her husband. For whatever that may or may not be worth, I was carried away emotionally. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reversed the decision because of all of the publicity and because of the judge's antics, basically. And he ordered a new trial. Ruby actually tried to commit suicide while he was in jail. They scheduled the new trial for Wichita, Kansas. And then Jack Ruby died in jail of cancer, which he had had apparently for some time. And of course, then a bunch of conspiracy theories, which we still hear about. I don't know how many books have been written about Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby, and, the FBI and the CIA and the Cubans, and it's just amazing that this still continues. Indeed, and of course we have the Warren Report, which you all remember and committed to memory. And then, many years later, there was a select committee in the House, the U.S. House, that met for many months to review all the conspiracy theories. The Committee on, I think they called it the assassination. And actually it was on the assassination of JFK and MLK. I think that was a dual effort. And so that report basically said that most of the facts that the Warren Commission had established were in fact quote unquote accurate. But they said they felt there had been not enough time and effort devoted to looking at the possibility of a conspiracy, between whom and amongst whom is never really quite clear. Again, just as a matter of interest, it's neither here nor there. My roommate at Harvard Law School was a guy named Dan Bellin, who was still a very good friend of mine. He practiced law, appeared before the Supreme Court on a number of occasions. His brother David was the executive director of the Warren Commission. And I had an opportunity to talk with David about the commission's work over the years. Based, of course, David wrote a book, actually, on this. And obviously he had spent a piece of his life involved in this, so he had something to, he had a piece in the game, there's no doubt. But in chatting with him over the time, I found that his discussion, his argument, his passion, and his words at least made sense to me. And I, well, I didn't read many of the conspiratorial books. I found it difficult to believe that it didn't happen pretty much as the way they said. So my point here is that there are many different ways that these issues arise, many different cases. And the circuits, the different circuits around the country, the federal circuits, are now pretty much split on how to handle these, this pretrial publicity, all of this business surrounding the proper method of conducting a trial. And we're about to hear, actually again, this is another little sidebar, with regard to freedom of speech, and that's the issue of New York Times v. Sullivan, which is the case about libel, and the case that I think in 1964, where the Supreme Court ruled that with regard to libel, that public officials could not sue for libel unless they could prove, quote unquote, malicious intent. And that,
Or reckless,
I'm sorry?
or reckless disregard.
Thank you. Were you accused?
I had to know that. And
So,
I read the Floyd Abrams thesis.
So, there are two cases that are coming up before the Supreme Court this term. And Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch have both already said in writing that they believe that the Sullivan case is bad law, and so I have no idea what the court is going to rule or what they will do with these cases, but I think there's a good possibility that New York v. Sullivan may be in for a rude awakening as we go forward. Yes, Joe.
It's a question for Joan.
Sure.
With the, it's very clear that judges matter a lot, and their experience matters a lot, getting it right as trials unfold. Could you comment on the judges that have been, or the likelihood of a change in process or outcome because of the Federalist Society approved judges that have been essentially moved through very quickly and very efficiently during the Trump administration and put in positions to make rulings? Do they have trial experience or experience that augurs well for finding justice, or are they going to be ideological?
Well, one hopes they're not going to be ideological, but a number of them have not been able to even get the approval of the American Bar Association, so I think that speaks badly. Some of them have never been in a courtroom. One had never taken a deposition. One had, some of them just don't have any experience, and I think some trial experience, some experience in the day-to-day life of the courtroom is necessary if you're going to be a good judge, for sure. But we can just be optimistic, but I really don't know. But I share your concern.
I think, if I might, yes.
I was going to ask her if she could talk about working with Lee Valley.
Oh, well. he was an absolutely brilliant person. And he was very committed to the law and to the rule of law. He was good on all fronts. He had been a Marine pilot. He could fly planes. He had planes and helicopters of his own. And before he practiced law, he was a private investigator. So he knew the importance of investigating a case, and that's one of the first things a defense lawyer does if you've got funds, is to send out your investigator and try and nail down the witness statements and get the facts. And so he knew that importance, and he always had a very good investigative staff. And he had a retentive mind that was unbelievable. Maynard sent you an excerpt of his examination of Dr. Kirk, I think it is, on the blood spatters.
Yes, right.
Well, he would know where each of those spatters were. I mean, it's very complicated, very confusing, and very boring. But he would know. He just retained an enormous amount of information. It was amazing to watch him because, these trial lawyers, they're flamboyant. They usually are, party guys. They're out all night partying and drinking, and then they get up in the morning and they try a case, and I'd be, as a backup person, kind of nervous, like, how are they going to do this? And they go into the courtroom and just regurgitate, be able to pull up all this information. It was just kind of incredible. So, he had a lot of combinations of a lot of good qualities. One thing I was telling Maynard is that he knew, one of his attributes was starting in to try and publicize the case in favor of the defendant. And in our office, he had a raised platform and all the lighting that the broadcast media would need so that he could give a news conference, on a moment's notice.
So he used that to his advantage.
Yes.
George?
Thank you.
Getting back to unqualified judges, is there a process for removing judges?
Well, I think there's an impeachment. You can impeach them, maybe.
Yeah. I think federal judges, the only
Yeah.
way to get rid of them is to impeach them. And that has proven to be like impeaching presidents. I mean, it just doesn't happen. It's very rare. There was a guy in Florida whose name was Alcee Hastings, who was a federal judge, and he was impeached. And he was convicted. He just passed away, and after he was convicted, he served 10 terms in the House of Representatives. So that's what happens to impeached judges. Counselor.
Yes, this is a local connection with F. Lee Bailey that I doubt many of you know about. I've been on the board at Cardigan Mountain School. That's a junior boarding school for young boys, grades 6 through 9. It's a great place. I've been on the board for almost 50 years. And the board members used to, and I was one of them, brag about the fact that F. Lee Bailey was the first graduate from Cardigan Mountain School in 1945. And then, years later, F. Lee Bailey was disbarred. And we were all agreed, let's stop bragging about it.
Well, if I can say, there's two sides to every story, and I don't really know the facts of all that, so I can't really offer an opinion. But what happens to defense lawyers is they're targets. The government wants to get rid of them. So just about every big criminal defense lawyer I know has either been they've been indicted. Things happen to them. I mean, in F. Lee Bailey's office, they're continually auditing them. For a while, we had the IRS had a desk in our office. They just don't. One lawyer we know, a trial lawyer, a criminal trial lawyer, he was basically entrapped by the government. They had a government person, a government witness who they were paying. The guy made like $75,000 a year, and his job was to keep calling this particular lawyer and trying to entice him into a money laundering scheme. And eventually the lawyer did help him launder a little money and was convicted on criminal charges. But, you know, it was an entrapment. The guy, they just come out after you if you're a criminal defense lawyer. One of the things that they say is, well, you might have gotten, you know, a $50,000 fee that you reported, but what kind of cash did you get? Now, how do you prove that you didn't get this cash? And so that the government is always harassing and trying to get rid of these you know, star criminal defense lawyers because they're, you know, they give them a lot of trouble. Yes?
One of the issues that we're going to talk about is freedom of the press.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how we go about defining press. Are the writers of Saturday Night Live press, or writers for the 11 o'clock shows that are on television, are they press? It's no longer just the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, it's or the networks. How do we define press, and how free should all of the press be?
Well, I think it's founded in our freedom of speech, which is an individual right. I'm trying to remember the wording of the First Amendment, but so the press is just one segment of that. But so I'd say everybody that goes on social media is free to speak as well.
Yeah, I think it seems to me that's
That's freedom of speech as opposed to freedom of the press.
yeah, but
Yeah.
I think that, Pete, I think that that's, you know, that's an ever rolling question. That I think that the court, in looking at that question, you know, continues to move, depending upon what they view as the facts in a particular case. So, Martha, what's the, you just gave us a phrase, but the...
Reckless disregard for the truth. And what the judges in the Sullivan case said was to not allow the press to have free speech would have such a chilling effect, I don't know that they used the words chilling effect, that you'd in essence hamstring the press, and that in a democracy you need a free and robust press as a watchdog to government, primarily, but government and private malfeasance. And if you know, gave the ability to sue the press every time they got something wrong, what press would be able to continue to operate, basically, because the risk would be too great for them to keep publishing.
I think...
Which is what they, sorry, but it's Floyd Abrams, who was the lawyer who represented the New York Times in that case, had a piece, editorial in the New York Times yesterday, and he said basically what I just described is the way the English system is. And there's lawsuits against the press in England apparently all the time, but I thought conversely there's also a really out of control press in England, so I don't know that it's really had a chilling effect.
I'm just thinking, comparing that with talking about the reporters today.
Yes.
An individual can say, has the freedom to speak, but does that mean that the press, Walter Cronkite could say whatever he wants?
No, I don't think...
believe him because traditionally he has checked his sources and everything else, whereby somebody else, modern reporters will say, this happened, and we checked with the backup hairdresser on the film site, therefore this is why I'm reporting it. So you never know they have the freedom to say that, even if it's not been
No,
verified.
the standard is a reckless disregard for the truth. So they have to either know or believe that what they're reporting is true. If they don't bother, if they just repeat a rumor, then they can be liable for libel because they didn't do their reporting and they showed a reckless disregard.
There is a process that they are supposed to.
Good, thank you.
Further, yes, oh, yeah.
Given the amount of process that is required for court systems and the fact that we, guarantee that virtually all of these criminal defendants have some level of representation.
Can you speak up a little more?
That we require all the defendants to have some level of representation, whether or not that representation is adequate. Is it really the case, as some would suggest, that we have a significant amount of people in jail that are actually innocent?
Well, I've got an answer, but Johnny,
I don't know.
I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways you can cut the statistics. So we've got more people in jail than any other country in the world by a long way. And a lot of those people have not been convicted of anything. Anything. And then a lot of those people have been convicted of nonviolent crime. So there are all kinds of categories here. How can somebody be in jail and not be convicted of anything? Because, for example, they can't come up with bail. Or, so we have, as I said, the criminal justice system, I think, is, leaves a lot to be desired. And people who are, who have little or no means, who are unsophisticated, have no access to a lawyer, etc., are at a disadvantage. Yes, there are public defenders. And some of these people, guys and gals, are wonderful and knock themselves out, but they are way overloaded. They can't possibly handle all the cases they have. So that part of the system doesn't work the way it should work, among other reasons for that purpose.
Well, there's another aspect to this. Most cases in the criminal system do not go to trial. I think over 90%, maybe even more in the federal system, are pleas. So what happens is, especially in the federal system, is the sentence that they're going to ask for if you're convicted is so onerous that people, but they give you a deal if you plea, that people are afraid to take the chance, and so that there, you have very, very few actual trials in the criminal system, in the state system and in the federal system. And most defendants do not have the resources that even like a Sam Shepard had. They don't have money for investigators. They don't have money for expert witnesses. You get one of these like a Dr. Kirkin, a splatter expert, that costs you, a large sum of money.
So do you think that half the people that are in jail right now either don't deserve to be there or are innocent to start with?
Well, I just don't know. When I worked at the jail, one of the court officers said to me, the people in here may not be guilty of what they're charged of, but they're guilty of something. Which
Just to add to what you're saying, it's implied in what you said, but most of them plead guilty.
Well, they plead guilty because of the system.
Yeah.
And we talked about this last week, actually. I think it was last week that I had some statistics on this very point. And Joni's absolutely right. It's well over 90% of the cases don't go to trial. Huge percentage of people plead, and they plead because for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is there's a lot of pressure on them to plead because the police have options. They can go after their family or their friends or whatever it is. They've got all kinds of pressure points that they can use. Now, does that mean that the person isn't guilty? I think the answer is, I don't know. And maybe the police don't know either. But that's the way the system has been working and continues to work at this point.
I mean, one thing the defense bar never asks their clients is, did you do it? You know, be truthful with me. It's not like television. Tell me the truth. Did you do it or not? That really is irrelevant because you want to develop a sense of trust with the defendant. So if you start pressing him on whether he's guilty or not, whether he did it, that's really not helpful to your relationship. And your job is to make the government prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Your job is to act in opposition to the government. It's not to determine the truth of, or the guilt or innocence of the person. So, you know, even as a defense lawyer, there were a lot of cases that in our office that we didn't know whether the person did it or not. We really just didn't know.
About 5 to 10% of those that go to trial are convictions. The majority of them. Yeah,
the criminal cases are, you lose. You lose in it. But sometimes a win can be, if a person is charged with first-degree murder and he's convicted a second. So you might not have won the case, but you want a chance for the person to someday be free from incarceration.
We said, I think it was last week, I'm just wondering who the lawyer was, but I cited a statistic for an attorney, I don't think it was Darrell, but an attorney who had 50 murder cases for first-degree murder, and there was only one conviction for first-degree murder out of 50 cases, and that was the case where he came in after the conviction to try and get a reversal.
It was Darrell.
So that is a record that, you know, a criminal lawyer can be proud of. The guy, they were mostly guys in those days, you know, didn't get the electric chair or you know, die, but he got life in prison, and maybe at some point he would get out. So, Martha.
That kind of puts a funny light on these number of cases where they find people are innocent after all these years in jail, especially on death row.
Well, these cases are, I don't know, Johnny, if you have a comment on it, these cases are mostly often DNA cases, you know.
Exactly.
One of the things in the Shepherd case, they found, you know, the DNA they came up with 30 or 40 years later, you know, apparently showed that, you know, there was a third party in the house and that the blood spatter in the room was not Sam's. Well, you know, that's pretty definitive. So
people go through a lot before they get to that point that
yes.
they find their innocence.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't have the science
Yeah, exactly.
back then.
Yeah. You look at the Gang of Five, is that what it was called?
Yeah, it was
in Central Park?
Central Park 5.
And they were all innocent, those kids.
Right, and we had a businessman at that time who turned out to be the former guy, who paid for ads that appeared in the New York Times and every other newspaper in New York, saying these guys are guilty, and you know, so you know, should the newspaper not run that ad? You know,
Paid the money.
it's a nice question.
Money talks.
That's a different course. Maybe not. Maybe. Yes, Mark?
I'm wondering if either one of you have an opinion on who actually killed Marilyn Shepherd.
Well, I'm tending towards Eberling.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, my take is, and I haven't read all the books, but my take is Everling is the most likely suspect. The story of the couple who live next door doesn't, you know, I can't see these two folks. First of all, the mayor, who was also a butcher by trade. So you know, if he was a butcher, it's possible, you know, he had had a history of, you know, hitting people with a hammer. But he wouldn't have hit Marilyn with a hammer, that doesn't make sense. He also had a bad leg, so that all the walking and up and down the stairs didn't make any sense. And I can't see the woman doing that, no matter how mad she was, it didn't seem reasonable at that way. And the thing with Everly is, you know, he was, they wrote him off quickly. And then there were a whole series of events that, you know, he went to jail for murder. And the DNA test said, they didn't identify it as his blood, but they said that his blood was within the samples it could have been. So I think given his history, his background, he had a very bad childhood, and he was, you know, he had washed windows in the house, he had access, you know, when you read that she was apparently raped that night, of the players, it would seem, I think, most likely.
Just, can you both talk about the lie detector issue? Because the lie detector test took him out of the contest for a while. And I believe that Sam Shepard said, I don't want to take one.
That's true.
Well,
Tell me about those things.
F. Lee Bailey,
Other than me, failed the lie detector.
F. Lee Bailey had a television show for a while where he administered, they had a man who he worked with administer lie detector tests to people. I guess celebrities or something, I don't exactly remember. But anyway, he was a great believer in it, but you really have to have the right administrator. It's really a very sophisticated thing. And this Eberling sounds like kind of maybe a sociopathic personality in some ways, and maybe that kind of personality, or maybe even had a split personality. So maybe that kind of person can avoid a detection.
Isn't
Right.
it also true that the lie detector tests they were given in 1954 are a lot different, I think, a lot less sophisticated than the lie detector tests they're giving now? I mean, I believe that's the case.
Yeah, I haven't heard them being used very much in criminal law. I mean, you hear about them being used, like people who work for the CIA have to take them periodically or something, but
Maybe we should have people in Congress take.
they're also sociopathic.
George,
Let's take a vote on who thinks that Sam was innocent.
okay? Let's do it. Who thinks Sam didn't do it? Well, there we go. We've changed the venue. And what good does that do Sam?
Yeah.
You know, I think that's the, so do you have any kind of final remarks?
Well, we didn't talk about sequestration of jury, which is right, you know, but that's rarely used. It was, I found this out, I had forgotten it, but the longest sequestered jury in American history was the OJ jury, which was sequestered for 8 months. But,
think about it. 8 months of what, in a motel somewhere?
Right.
I mean, think about what that involves and what the cost of that is. And what that does to a person's family. I mean, you know, where's Dad? Well, he's in a motel somewhere. You know.
They spent more time in jail than OJ.
I mean, there's the point.
well, you know, they used to use it a lot more, but it really is out of favor, and there's a lot of problems with sequestering a jury, and one of which is, you know, people tend to drink too much. You know, because if the trial ends at 3 o'clock and then you have to go back to your motel or whatever, and then they have to take you out to dinner, and then people start drinking, and people have been known to have affairs. You know, it's very disruptive kind of a thing. So they really don't like to do it. What the courts are kind of doing today is they're saying, well, we can correct things through voir dire and corrective instruction. And the science shows that that really isn't true. And when they talk about tainted evidence in a trial, in Massachusetts, there's a case where they said, it's like a skunk has run through the courtroom. You can catch the skunk and get rid of the skunk, but the stench remains. And you can't get rid of this tainted information that people have received. And no one really has an answer for that at this point.
So that's the line in every Perry Mason show, and you've seen it in many movies. The jury will disregard that line. Forget the elephant that just came walking across.
And that's when the jurors' ears perk up because, oh, what did that must be important.
So.
In the Sam Shepard case that you talked about was the fact that the jury in that case, they knew who they were and they were all independent and everything. But when you get down to the children case, that was on television, but they never showed the jury.
Right.
At what point did it turn that juries just weren't advertised?
Well, they even don't give out their names ever. I think it's like kept secret.
They interview them afterwards sometimes.
There was an account of this Aubrey trial that's going on in the South. A black man who was jogging, who was.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yes.
They were making a citizen's arrest supposedly and eventually shot him. The jurors are, being queried about being on the panel, and they're saying they're afraid. They're probably afraid, no matter what verdict, they come out with, there are people that are going to say, we know where you live on social media. So they're having a hard time getting a jury because people are afraid to serve.
Yes.
What kind of effect is the press going to have on that particular trial?
Well, there's been a video released.
Story about that.
Yeah.
I was in LA during OJ, and it was the trial was a huge moneymaker for all the press. I mean, every freelancer in Los Angeles and the surrounding states was employed for the duration of that. And of course, the jury was sequestered and not named, and the press was instructed by the judge, you under no circumstances, when this is over, you will attempt to chase them or follow them or, all sorts of. But the TV stations, and I'm sure the newspapers did it too, had people on their staff go into the parking lots and try and figure out who the names were based on, seeing jurors get into their cars and getting their license plate numbers and tracking them that way and following them. And they eventually did because.
Well, defense counsel have been known to do that too. I mean, the investigators for defense counsel try and find out who these jurors are.
Right.
Find out.
What about the free press on that particular trial?
The what?
What was the question?
The press?
Yeah. In other words, there's been a lot in the news even before the trial started.
Oh, in that situation. Well, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, there are articles out there that we have mass resignations all over the country from people who have for years run elections in communities. They don't want to, they don't want any part of it anymore. We have school board people who, I'm out of here. I'm not interested in playing in this game. I think it's a very potentially serious problem. And I don't know what the answer is. I need another drink, I think.
I believe in this current Aubrey case that one of the questions of the potential jurors is, even though you have seen all of this footage, whether or not you feel you can still give quote-unquote an impartial judgment, and whether or not they're taking that into consideration or not. But I think that question is being asked.
But do jurors necessarily answer that honestly?
Correct.
They may mistakenly believe that they can be impartial, Or they may want to be on the jury so much because it's a prominent case and that they'll not tell the truth about that. So it's very hard. I don't know what the answer is.
Well, we've come to the end of our class. Let's give Joni a...
Thank you.
Many thanks for your assistance. Next week, the trials of Lenny Bruce. How many of you actually saw Lenny Bruce perform? What kind of a group is this? Well, so this is a lot about four-letter words. So, and there were lots of trials. They were in New York, LA, San Francisco, and Chicago. Put on your big boy pants. Come prepared with all the four-letter words you know. And we'll see if we can work our way through it. Thank you very much.